Hey, this is Waylon from Swiftwood Bows. I'm going to share the process of building this Osage recurve from stave to finished bow. I consider this more of an advanced build, so if you're new to bow making, I recommend starting with one of my beginner videos before you leap into a project like this. This static Osage recurve is one of my favorite designs that I come back to over and over. It's elegant, fast, and reliable. Let's get started. This is a high-stress design, so it's important to start with high-quality stave. You can make a recurve out of a challenging stave, but all those issues will be magnified compared to a straight-limbed bow. So my advice is to find the straightest, cleanest stave you have access to. This is a pretty exceptional stave. Virtually no knots, straight with no twist, good rings, just a couple mild dips and dives that'll be easy to correct with a heat gun. These are the kind of staves that I set aside for recurve projects. These rings are thick enough to chase easily and have a good ratio between early and late wood. They're all pretty uniform, so I'm simply going to go down one ring to get a clean back. I'm going to start by removing the wood from the ring above the one I want for my back until I've revealed a patch of the new ring. I'm careful not to dig into the exposed ring. I want it to be as pristine as possible. Once I've exposed it, I want to widen that area to make a strip going all the way across the stave with a clearly defined edge. That edge will give me a clear line of attack as I chase the ring. My draw knife will slide along my back ring until it hits that leading edge of the ring on top, biting into the crumbly early wood and advancing my line. I like to leave some remnants of the early wood as I go, just enough to show me that I'm not biting into my ring. If necessary, I use my card scraper to clean up the surface and show clearly where my line of transition is. If I can clearly maintain that line of transition, I can quickly and confidently chase the ring down the entire length of the stave. The main obstacles you'll face when chasing a ring are knots and valleys. You'll need to slow down and possibly use some other tools like a gooseneck scraper to navigate those spots without violating your ring. Once you've chased the ring all the way to the end, you can come back with a card scraper and clean off the remnants of the early wood you left behind. This should leave you with a pristine growth ring as the back of your bow. It's important you take your time and chase your ring carefully, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with it. It's one of the most important steps in the process for ensuring a safe and durable bow. The growth ring on the back is taking on the tension load for the bow. Any violations in that ring can be a potential point of failure and will result in a broken bow. Just giving a quick wipe of shellac to prevent drying checks. Not totally necessary, but helpful. Here is my finished back, all ready for laying out the profile of the bow. First, I'd like to establish my center line. If you have a truly straight stave, you could pop a chalk line, but most of the time you want to follow any contours of grain to ensure there are no violations. On a split stave, you can typically use the edge of the stave as a guide. Next, I will establish the overall length of the bow and mark the center. This bow will be for a 28-inch draw length, so I double 28 to get 56, add 8 for the handle and fades, and add 2 for the tips. That gives me an overall length of 66 inches. The bow will be 64 inches nock to nock. I'll mark the center point at 33 inches. I'll start laying out the bow at the handle. The handle is 4 inches long, 2 inches to either side of the center. To make a slightly bulbous handle, I'll mark it 1 inch at each end of the handle and 1¼ inch at the center. Then I simply connect the dots to draw the handle. Next, the fades will be 2 inches long. The width of the fades is determined by the intended draw weight of 55 pounds and the fact that it's a recurve. For this bow, I'm choosing 1¾ inch width. I'll maintain that width of 1¾ inch for 12 inches before I start the taper towards the tips. This ensures there's enough mass in the limbs to store the required energy and not take set. If there are any deviations in the grain through this area, you need to follow it faithfully with these lines. Your center line should already be following the grain, so these side lines should stay faithful to that center line while maintaining a consistent width. The width at the tips should be 1/2 inch. Use a straight edge to draw a line from the end of your full width to the tips. Once again, this needs to stay faithful to the grain and maintain a consistent taper. Here's the full layout of the bow. You can see it's not perfectly straight due to the variations in the stave, but I'll be able to correct that later with some heat. Now it's time to use my draw knife to rough out the front profile of the bow. I'm going to get as close to the line with the draw knife as the grain will safely allow. If I start to feel any tear out, I can switch over to a rasp, which is slower but safer. I want to keep the edges perpendicular to the back as I go. Once I get as close as comfortable to the line with the draw knife, I'll switch to reducing the wood on the belly, so I don't have so much surface area to fight against with my rasp as I bring it down exactly to the line. Here it is roughed out with the draw knife and ready to reduce the thickness. You can see I didn't get down into the handle area. I'll tackle that later. I'm going to give myself some guidelines on the side of the stave to keep my initial wood removal safe and consistent. First, I'll start by marking out my handle in fades. I extend the lines down the side of the bow to show the length of the handle in the fades. The depth of the handle will be 2 inches for now, but will get reduced later to be more around 1½ inches. This taper goes down to 1 inch thick fades. Thicker than we'll need in the end, but this will be a good start. Next, I'll draw out a line from tip to handle that establishes a smooth and consistent taper, going from about 1/2 inch at the tip to 1 inch at the fade. Use the back of the bow as a guide for your hand to ensure the belly matches the back and gives you a consistent taper. Now it's time to rip off some wood to reduce the thickness. This is an opportunity to be aggressive with the draw knife. As long as you respect your line, there's not much risk of messing anything up, so let her have it. I like to start up near the handle and really dig in. I rip off the corners first, and then go after the ridge that gets left in the middle. With some practice and confidence, you can make short work of this step, even if you have a lot of wood to get through. I showed you the draw knife method on one limb. On the other, I'll show you how I would tackle it with a bandsaw, in case that's a tool you have at your disposal. It's certainly a lot faster, but you have to be careful, because it can ruin your bow just as fast if you're not careful. The main trick to roughing out a bow with a bandsaw is tilting the stave slightly so that it's cutting wide on the bottom side that you can't see. If you just cut perpendicular, it might turn out great on one edge, but end up too thin on the bottom edge that you can't see. Then you simply flip it over and cut off the remains with the same tilted angle. That'll leave you a ridge in the middle that you could carefully remove with the bandsaw, or just as easily with the draw knife. Now that we've got it roughed out here, it's still clearly too thick to start bending, so we're going to need to take some more thickness off. I'm going to run my hand down the back of the bow here, giving myself a new line to work with. I'm still trying to maintain that consistent thickness taper, going from slightly thinner out at the tips to a little bit thicker and near the handle. Here's the bow all roughed out with the lines drawn on it, ready for some more reducing. Going back to the draw knife now. Some people might feel more comfortable getting closer on the bandsaw, but at this stage I really trust the draw knife and I feel like it can be just as quick. I'm going to continue to use that method of ripping down the corners right down to the line. I'll do that on both sides. That's going to leave me that ridge in the middle. I'll just come back and take that ridge off, flattening out the limb and giving myself my new thickness that I'm going for. Here's the bow now roughed out a little bit thinner. I'm going to do a little bit of floor tillering here just to get a sense for how the bow's bending initially, making sure each limb bends about the same amount as the other limb. One's not too strong or too weak. This is also a good opportunity to start using my fingers to feel the thickness. I want to feel that consistent taper going from thick down to thin. If I notice any obvious thick spots or thin spots, I'm going to mark them. The limbs still feel a little bit too thick here, so I'm just going to reduce the thickness consistently a little bit more down the length of each limb. Now I'm going to dig into this handle section here with the draw knife. You have to be super careful, otherwise it's easy to tear into your width profile. So I'm going to dig in from one direction, down in towards the center of the handle. but then I'm going to turn around and come from the other side to meet in the middle. You have to be careful with your strokes. If you pull too hard, you might go further than you intend. So I'm just going to use this draw knife here to get the bulk of the material out of here. I don't need to get it perfect down to the line. I can come back with a rasp to clean it up. But using the draw knife for this process will save you a lot of time. Getting all that material out of there with a rasp is going to be time consuming. But if you're not feeling confident with the draw knife, it's certainly safer to do it with the rasp. Now that I've got the thickness reduced, I like to come back and work on the sides again with the rasp. The reason I wait to do this is because I don't like fighting against all that surface area that you have with such a thick bow. This makes this process a lot quicker. So I use the Shinto rasp here, and I'm really just smoothing out those edges, getting right down to my line, making a nice consistent thickness. Once the sides are all evened out, I'm going to come back with a rasp, and I'm going to really aggressively round over those corners on the belly. This is a matter of taste and style. There's plenty of people that will leave their bow with a real flat rectangular cross section the whole time they're tillering. For some reason, I'm able to see what's going on and feel what's going on a lot better if I've got those corners rounded off. Plus it makes for more efficient wood removal with scrapers and rasps and such. Once I've got the edges on the belly rounded off consistently, I'm going to come back with a card scraper, get everything cleaned up, get rid of all the tool marks, clean up the edges, and then I'm going to roll over the corner on the back edge a little bit more subtly, not quite so aggressively as I did on the belly. Because having a sharp corner can be a liability for lifting a splinter once the bow starts bending some more. Here's the bow all cleaned up. You can see on this limb that there's a bit of natural deflex. I'm going to remove that later with some heat, but for now we need to account for it when we're doing our early tillering. It's going to appear weaker than it actually is. At this point I'm ready to do some early tillering. I made a stringing strap with large reinforced cups at the end for this stage. This is essentially the same as long string tillering. I just do it this way because it's faster and easier and doesn't need knocks. My main goal at this stage is to look for balance between the limbs. I want them working the same amount. I can also look to see the overall shape of the bend and make sure it looks healthy. If I notice any stiff areas like this one, I'll mark it and do some extra wood removal there. I'll continue with checking the tiller, using the strap and removing wood from stiff areas until I'm satisfied with the bend. Then I'll do some even wood removal from both limbs until I feel like I could reasonably string the bow with a short string. That's my indicator that it's ready to add the static recurves. Before I do that, I'm going to tackle this handle and get it worked down a little further. As you can see, it's way too bulky. It's going to end up much narrower than this. The fades are currently extending too far out onto the working limb. I'm going to need to work those down as well. Using a draw knife in here can be a little risky if you don't know what you're doing, but it can save a lot of time if you're careful. I'm going to take as much off with it as I safely can before I switch to the safer but slower rasp. The main thing is not to pull into the grain of the bow. I'm going to mark fresh lines on the side of the handle showing where the handle is and where the fades start and stop. This will give me guidelines as I work down the chunky fades. You can see here how the lines clearly show the hump that needs to be reduced. Once again, I'll take off as much as I dare with the draw knife, being careful not to dig into the working limbs at the end of my strokes. Then I'll switch over to my rasp to reduce it further. Once I'm satisfied with the thickness of the fades, I'll switch over to reducing the width of the handle. Those lines I drew at the end of the handle indicate where I want the narrowest parts of the handle to be. Remember, I'm going for a slightly bulbous shape handle. When I work on my handle, I like to work on it as a whole, moving from place to place and frequently checking to make sure the look and feel are right. If you get too focused on just one spot, you may take it too far and then end up with a handle that's too small or funny shaped. I don't need to work the handle down to its final dimensions yet. In fact, at this stage, I'm not even sure exactly what I want to do with the handle. But for now, I just want to get it closer to finished so it's not so bulky. Now I'm ready to recurve the tips. To prepare them, I want to make sure the thickness of the outer limbs is very consistent, ideally down to a continuous growth ring on the belly. I also want it rounded and smooth. It's good to mock up your bend beforehand to make sure everything is set. I've filled in the bottom of the cut with a piece of leather to make sure the tip is tight with no wiggle room. I have a metal band, in this case a ruler, tied up against the belly of the bow. If this is pressed against the bow when it bends, it will hold down any splinters that might start lifting, preventing them from growing. Your radius could vary depending on what you want from your recurve. I've seen nice bows made with larger and smaller radiuses than this, but I like the results of this jig. As you can see, the jig simply follows the radius of the circle. I used a 6-inch lid to trace mine. Have a couple of squeeze clamps ready at hand. The method I prefer is to immerse the tips of the bow into boiling water. An old steel kettle is perfect for this, as long as the tip can fit all the way into the bottom. Get the water boiling hard and stick the tip in all the way. Wrap an old cloth around the bow where it meets the kettle to hold in the heat. Don't use your wife's good cloths, it'll get stained. The bow should stay in the boiling water for 20 minutes. I haven't found any advantages for doing it longer than that. You need to be quick transitioning between the boiling water and the jig. It starts to cool off rapidly, but take a second to make sure you're bending it the right way. That's important. Hold the metal band tight against the belly and bend it smoothly and confidently, listening out for anything concerning. Small splinters contained by the metal band are not typically a big deal. There should be enough thickness in your tips that you can rasp them off later. Sometimes you'll notice that the recurves don't align well with the handle due to the variations in the limb. This is a great time to correct that. Wedge a piece of leather under the edge that needs to go up and clamp down on the opposite edge. This will twist the limb while the wood is still relaxed from the heat. After it's cool to the touch, you can remove it and the recurve should stay. If you want to be extra sure that the recurve doesn't pull out, you can keep it on the form and heat that recurved area thoroughly with a heat gun on the belly side, and then let that cool off. Go ahead and repeat the whole process on the other tip. Here she is with both sides flipped. As you can see, the tips do not align perfectly with the handle. That happens frequently, even with the correction you can make initially with the leather and the clamp. Fortunately, it's easy to correct. Sometimes you get lucky and don't need to futz too much with the alignment, but don't be discouraged if you have to do several corrections to get it to line up perfectly. It's par for the course when making an Osage recurve. Don't settle for less than perfect though. Alignment is super important on recurves. Here's my method for adjusting the recurve. I have two bench vices on either end of my bench. One holds the form and the other holds the bow. I clamp the bow solidly to the form. Sometimes having two clamps here helps to hold it in place better. I need this tip to go down to fix the alignment. I use a leather pad to act as a fulcrum. It's good to double check that you have it the right way. Then I simply clamp the tip down until it's gone slightly past where I need it. You can sight down the bow to see that everything is lining up well. Once it looks good, you can heat up the belly where you want it to take the correction. Get it good and hot, but no need to discolor the wood. Double check the alignment and then let it cool completely before removing it. Now it's back to the early tillering process. The bow will be quite a bit stiffer now that it's recurved, so we'll have to remove more wood before it's ready to string. I'll check the tiller with the strap, noting where it's bending or where it's not. I'll use my finger calipers to feel for thick spots and mark them for wood removal. I've switched over to the scraper at this stage. It gives me more control and consistency. Plus, it keeps the wood surface clean and smooth. I'm going to repeat these steps of checking the tiller with the strap, checking taper with my fingers, and removing wood where it's necessary to improve the tiller. Once the tiller looks good, I will take even amounts of wood off of each limb to maintain a balanced tiller and reduce the weight of the bow until it feels reasonable to use a short string. It's important that you don't remove wood from the actual recurves at this stage. It's okay for them to become chunky compared to the working limbs. We can refine them closer to the end of the process, but if you make them too thin now, they could pull out. At this stage, I feel comfortable putting a short string on the bow. It's an important step. It'll give us a lot more information about the tiller and the alignment. But first I need to prepare the tips. I'm choosing to add horn tip overlays to this bow, but self-nocks will work fine as well. This piece of horn is 2 inches long. I need to prepare both the pieces of horn and the tips of the bow to get a good glue bond. I flattened the edges of this horn tip so that my vise will hold it more securely. I saw the pieces in half to get my overlays. When I flip it over, I carefully mark where the lines meet on each side to make sure the cut is even. I use a belt sander to flatten the bottoms of the overlay. Watch your fingers. Once I have a perfectly flat gluing surface, I will shape the overlay to make a point that will lead back into the bow. It will look something like this. Then I taper the tip down to a point from the top of the overlay. They will sit on the bow like this. But I need to make a perfectly flat surface on the bow to get a good glue line. I like to use the farrier's rasp to do this job because it's wide and flat. I'm careful to keep it perfectly flat and not rock it back and forth. Be careful not to dig a trench with the edge of the rasp here. Keep at it till the surface is perfect. You want the overlay to sit on the surface with no light gaps at all. I like to have it hang over the end a little bit at this stage. I score both surfaces with a hacksaw blade to give the glue something to grab onto. I'm using a good quality thick superglue for this. You can also use high quality epoxy like Smooth On EA40. Make sure your point is aligned well. Wipe off your excess glue and then clamp it down until it's dry. My goal with the tips at this stage is to make them functional but sturdy. I'm not worried about making them pretty yet. First, I need to narrow them up a bit with a rasp. Then I'll work down the height a bit. Be careful you don't take away too much height, as you'll need it for a deep groove. I'm just tidying it up a bit so it's smooth and the string won't catch. I'll make the string groove about halfway up. I start going straight across, but then angle it back towards the handle as I come down the sides. I just need it deep enough to hold the tillering string securely. Then I tidy up the leading edge to make it flow into the bow so that the string doesn't catch. I work the backside down a bit to make sure the tip can fit well into the cups of the stringer. This is about what I'm going for at this stage, functional and sturdy. I want to help keep the string securely in the middle of the belly so that it doesn't roll off on one side or the other. To do this, I'll use a round file and hollow out the section where the string contacts the bow. Now it's time for the moment of truth, the first brace. Be careful and mindful at this point. Make sure the loops are securely in the grooves and the string is laying in the center of the recurves. Go slowly and be ready to unstring it quickly if you see anything seriously wrong. I keep a firm grip on the handle, ready to take the pressure off immediately if needed. If everything looks good, I'll take the stringer off and take a closer look. This is a great opportunity to judge the tiller as well as the alignment. Take note of any issues and mark them on the bow so you'll remember how to fix them. This is a great opportunity to judge the tiller as well as the alignment. Take note of any issues and mark them on the bow so you will remember how to fix them. Take note of the distance between the string and the limb on each side to make sure the limbs are bending equally. Sight down the string to make sure it's tracking through the center of the handle and that both recurves are aligned properly. This one still needs a little tweaking. After examining the bow with my eyes and fingers, I've marked some thick spots that need wood removal and some thin spots to avoid for the time being. Using the scraper, I'm going to continue the process of tillering and weight reduction with the benefit of the information I got from stringing the bow. I'll always stop to feel the taper carefully throughout the whole process of tillering. I've found that my fingers can pick up on slight issues before they even become apparent to the eye. A perfect taper will give you a perfect tiller. Once I'm satisfied with the taper and tiller at brace, then I'm ready to use the tillering tree to continue the process and start working the bow limbs. The first time I work the limbs, I'm not paying attention to the draw weight or draw length. I'm just gently moving the limbs a little to see what they do. I'm looking for areas that aren't moving at all or areas that are moving too much. If everything looks okay, then I will adventure further out with it, pulling it down more. I have 2 rules of thumb on the tillering tree. First and most important, I never pull the bow further than I need to see an issue. If the tiller doesn't look good, then pulling it further is only risking harm to the bow. I should stop and address the issue. If everything looks good, then the second rule applies. Never pull the bow past your intended draw weight. This bow is supposed to be a 55-pound bow. To pull more than 55 pounds is taking an unnecessary risk. Make sure to take into account any spots of natural reflex or deflex in the limbs. They will mess with your eye and make you think you have a stiff spot or a weak spot. Trust your fingers to feel the taper in this case, or use heat to straighten out the limb. You can use a ruler to measure the tiller at the deepest place just out of the fades. The distance should be equal or just favoring the top limb by 1/8 of an inch. When the tiller looks good on the tree and the taper feels good, then reduce the draw weight by taking even scrapes off each limb, stopping to feel the taper after each session of wood removal. Remember to avoid thinning out the recurves. Here's the bow being pulled out further. I'm noticing an area here on the right limb that is stiff, so I'll mark off the areas that I need to remove more wood. As I feel the taper with my fingers, I can tell that this area is a bit too thick. After removing the wood and checking it again, I can see that it still needs more work. You can see here on the left side that it's bending too much compared to the corresponding area on the right where it remains stiff. Sometimes I'll do some scraping with the bow still braced as a time saver. Just be careful you don't nick the string with the scraper. Getting it back on the tree, I can see that things have evened out and the bow is bending well on both sides. I like the tiller well enough that I'm going to switch back over to even wood removal to drop the weight. I aim to remove enough wood to gain about an inch of progress on the tillering tree. Not too slow, not too fast. I'm far enough along in the tillering process that I feel comfortable refining the tips. The top tip will be sleeker and pointier, and the bottom tip will be shorter and more blunt, because it will be more likely to contact the ground. I use a variety of files to get in there and shape the tip so that it is flowing and attractive. On the bottom of the tip, I swoop the limb up towards the tip. You can see now why I left a bit of horn hanging off when I glued it. Here's the top tip down to its final dimensions and only needing some sanding. Next, I'm going to refine the handle. I start organically shaping the handle with a rasp, working at it from all sides and angles. I'm trying to maintain the basic shape I've established while reducing the overall dimensions to make it more comfortable in my hand, keeping in mind the leather will bulk it up at the end. Here it is reduced down to a comfortable and attractive size. You can see how narrow I was able to make the ring on the back. As long as you don't cut completely across it, you can get away with a pretty narrow strip. Here's the bow at close to full draw length and draw weight on the tiller tree. The bow will be 55 pounds at 28 inches, but I've stopped at about 55 pounds at 27 inches, so I can spend some time shooting it in and still have a little wiggle room if I need to make adjustments. I like to shoot about 100 arrows through a freshly tillered bow to put it through its paces. Sometimes the tiller can shift with some shooting, so I want to be able to register that change and address it if needed. I've decided I wanted to add a skin to the back of this bow to pretty it up. It's certainly not a necessary step, as this bow would be perfectly functional and durable as it is. To prepare the back, I'm first going to sand off the shellac and clean it up with some 80 grit. Then I'll size the back with a thin layer of watered down Titebond 3. This prevents the wood from drinking up the glue when you apply the skin and starving the bond. While that's drying, I'll soak my skins. I've decided to go with a pair of wolffish skins on this one, but the method I'm using would work equally well for any snakeskin or rawhide. I blot them dry on a towel. Once again, probably not a good bath towel. Then I trim them to size, including cutting out a V to fit around the overlays. This time I'm more generous with the glue, though I still like to water it down a bit. I press the skin down and work out any air bubbles. On recurves, I like to cut some slits in the sides of the skin if they stick out past the edges, because as the skin dries and shrinks, it can pull away from the bow at the bend, unless the tension is relieved with these cuts. Then I'll use a strip of t-shirt material to firmly and evenly wrap down the length of the bow. Once it's all wrapped up, I like to clamp it down in a reflexed position to encourage the skin to dry with some tension. I'll remove the wrap after a half an hour to an hour, depending on how thick the skin is. I'll check again for air bubbles or gluing issues while it's still a bit pliable, and then I'll let it dry for a couple of days until the skin is totally dry and hard. I'll use a fine rasp to remove the edges. The trick to getting clean looking edges is to maintain a very consistent angle with your tool. Then I'll come back with a finer file to clean up the line even further and roll the edge up onto the back of the bow a little further. Here's what it should look like when it's finished. Next, I'll add an arrow rest to the side of the handle. It's not a necessary step. In fact, I prefer to shoot off my hand on all my personal bows, but the customer requested an arrow rest for this bow. I start by measuring out exactly where the arrow rest should go at the top of the handle, and then flatten out a spot to glue the rest on the handle. Like the tips, I'll score the surface with a hacksaw blade for better gluing. For the rest, I'm using a wooden golf tee that's been flattened on one side and tapered to blend with the handle. I'll use the same thick superglue to apply it. After it's clamped and dried, I will file it down and blend it with the handle. I'll then glue a piece of cork down over it to further blend it. I shape the cork down most of the way and then soak it with thin superglue so it's easier to smooth out without crumbling. After I sand the bow going from 150 grit to 220 to 320 to 4/0 steel wool, I'll give it a quick coat or two of shellac as a base coat, and then build up my layers of true oil over several days. I have another video showing my process for applying true oil if you'd like to see more details on that. Here's the bow all finished up and ready for action. I added a few more cosmetic details that you probably notice. I painted a border along the skins, I scorched the grain and the fades with a blowtorch, and added a beaver tail leather handle wrap. I wanted to keep this video mainly focused on the recurve build itself, so I chose not to add those steps to the video. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and I hope it will be helpful when building your own recurves. It's a great design that's time-tested and hard to beat. Good luck with your project, and have fun building.